when Gavin Newsom talks about California. He's like, I'm very big on California, very bullish on California. Hey, they're all moving. The only reason why they don't move is because it's too difficult to move. It's too expensive to leave versus all the bullshit with all the permits and all that. It's too expensive.
I was on KBLA yesterday with my friend Tavis Smiley. I'm an investor and a supporter of that station. And he said, who do you want to run for president? I mentioned, I think you'd be good at the job. Not this year, we know. No, I know. But he said, I don't think he could win. I don't think he could win. He's too progressive coming from this state and what he's done in this state to win in any southern state, any red state. I disagreed, but no, this is a progressive African-American owned station, and I'm sure they like you, but he doesn't think you can win. What do you say to that if you could win look at the swing states, there's only 8 of them.
It all started with a man who seemed untouchable. Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, walked into every camera shot like he owned the place chin up, hair perfect, that trademark confident smile plastered across his face. He didn't just run California, he branded himself as California. To hear him talk, the state was thriving, the economy booming, and the people happier than ever. But behind that glossy image was a reality even his most loyal fans were starting to see. The moment the cracks began to show wasn't in some backroom political meeting, it was out in the open. His polished tone began to falter. That cool, calculated image couldn't hide the weight of the growing criticism. People weren't buying the act anymore. And when the spotlight hit, instead of shining brighter, Newsom's performance started to unravel. The swagger that once defined him began to look more like arrogance, and the public mood shifted fast. By the way, before we continue, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us grow and share more intriguing stories. Now let's continue. California was supposed to be his kingdom, but the very stage he built was becoming a trap.
Going on in California, it isn't slowing down. The games are not slowing down. Newsom did eventually come out and apologize. If you want to go on Twitter, Rob, and just go to the apology video that he came out eventually. This is, I think, 4-5 days later. On day one, I asked him, I said, are you going to come out and do this? Watch how he's finally wanting to have his people be responsible. Go ahead, Rob.
You incite violence. I want to be clear about this. If you incite violence or destroy our communities, you're going to be held to account.
Okay.
That kind of criminal behavior will not be tolerated. Full stop. Already more than 220 people have been arrested, and we're reviewing tapes to build additional cases.
The man who once appeared unshakable was showing signs of strain, and the whispers were turning into headlines. The illusion was fading, and everyone from his rivals to his former supporters was starting to smell blood in the water. This was no longer about politics. This was the beginning of a downfall. Then came the moment that set the internet on fire. It wasn't just one critic, it was a full lineup. Bill Maher, Joe Rogan, and even Mel Gibson came out swinging. Yes, Mel Gibson. When an actor best known for his brutal on-screen takedowns decides to turn his aim on you, you know it's not going to be gentle. Maher went first, cutting through the fluff with a calm but devastating precision. He didn't yell, didn't grandstand, he simply pointed out the cracks in Newsom's leadership. Rogan followed, tearing into the logic, or lack of it, behind some of California's most controversial policies. And then Gibson, in true Hollywood fashion, delivered the kind of blunt insult that sticks in the public's mind long after the headlines fade. It wasn't just political criticism, it was a coordinated public shredding of everything Newsom had spent years building. The image of California as a shining progressive utopia was ripped apart on live shows and across social media. What made it even worse was how quickly the clip spread. Within hours, their words were everywhere: memes, reaction videos, podcasts. People weren't just nodding along, they were laughing, mocking, and sharing every jab these men threw at him.
He is under assault before our eyes. This moment we have feared has arrived. What Donald Trump wants most is your fealty, your silence to be complicit in this moment. Do not give in to him. The rule of law has increasingly been given way to the rule of Don. The founding fathers, they didn't live and die to see this kind of moment. It's time for all of us to stand up. Justice Brandeis, He said it best. In a democracy, the most important office, with all due respect, Mr. President, is not the presidency, and it's certainly not governor. The most important office is office of citizen.
The man who once seemed above the fray was now the center of a feeding frenzy, and the blows were coming from every direction. This wasn't just bad press, it was a public unmasking. Newsom's response didn't help his case, it made things worse. Just days after those high-profile hits, cameras caught a version of him no one was used to seeing. Gone was the cool, calculated politician who could spin any question into a campaign ad. In his place stood a man who looked cornered, voice cracking as he stumbled through a public apology. It wasn't a quick statement either. This came after several days of silence, where speculation only grew louder. When he finally stepped up to the microphone, his tone was defensive, his eyes glassy. You could see the strain written all over his face. This was the same guy who had spent years brushing off criticism like it was lint on his suit, now struggling to keep it together. And the contrast was impossible to ignore. Not long before this, he'd been the loudest voice in the room, daring federal authorities to come arrest me as he defied national policies. He walked with swagger, acting like he was untouchable. But standing there now, apologizing in front of flashing cameras, that swagger had evaporated. The public didn't see strength, they saw a man who had just been backed into a corner and forced to eat his own words. And for a leader who had built his brand on control and confidence, that was devastating. The fall from bravado to near breakdown happened so fast it felt like whiplash. And at the center of that whiplash was one explosive issue that lit the fuse: California's parental notification policy.
Today, the Trump administration, they talked about the fact that California had a rule that schools cannot be required to notify parents if their kids in school have changed their gender, their pronouns. That's the kind of thing, even though it doesn't affect a lot of people, that makes a lot of people go, well, you know what? That's the party without common sense. Now, if that's your state, how are you?
Well, I just disagree with that. I mean, the law was you would be fired. A teacher would be fired if a teacher did not report or snitch on a kid talking about their gender identity. I just think that was wrong. I think teachers should teach. I don't think they should be required to turn in kids. And by the way,
we're talking about their parents. How can you snitch? The idea of a snitch and a parent, to me, doesn't compute.
Well, I don't. But what is the job of a teacher? It's to teach. If Johnny's talking about some identity issue or some issue about liking someone of the same sex, is the teacher's job.
F-bomb comment. He's an evil snake motherfucker. I don't know how to describe it. You see what he just did there, and Bill got it right. Somehow it's snitching if the parent finds out. If the teacher says, oh, your kid has been going by other names and changing pronouns and dressing up this way, you don't know about that as the parents. That's the snitch. It's the parent's job to raise the child.
This was the law that allowed teachers to keep life-changing information from parents if a student decided to change their gender identity at school. No phone call home, no conversation, just silence. Bill Maher didn't dance around it. On his show, he laid it out plainly: how can you call it snitching when a teacher tells a parent about their own child? He argued that parents have the right to know, especially about something so personal and significant. That question hung in the air, and no amount of smooth talking from Newsom could make it go away. Critics saw the policy as a direct attack on parental rights, and Maher's words made it crystal clear. To them, this wasn't about compassion, it was about control. It painted a picture of a government that thought it could raise children better than their own families. For Newsom, defending the law was a gamble. He doubled down instead of backing off, proudly standing by the decision. But that move only fueled the fire. Suddenly, this wasn't just a California debate, it became a national flashpoint. And the damage went far beyond policy disagreements. In that moment, people saw him not as a leader protecting freedom, but as someone stripping away the most basic right a parent has to know what's happening in their child's life. That's when the shift among his own supporters began. The same progressives who once celebrated him as California's golden boy started to step back. At first, it was subtle, less applause at events, quieter defenses on social media. Then it turned into something impossible to ignore. It wasn't just conservatives calling him out anymore. In progressive circles, people began whispering that he had crossed a line. What they once saw as bold leadership was now coming across as overbearing, even preachy. The parental rights issue wasn't just a policy dispute, it was the moment many realized he was running too far ahead of the very people who had put him in power. Newsom's leadership started to feel less like serving the public and more like chasing an ideological checklist. Instead of focusing on solutions that worked in the real world, it seemed like every move was about scoring points with the most extreme corners of his base. And that alienated a lot of people who had once been in his corner. The change in tone was noticeable everywhere: town halls, radio talk shows, online forums. The glowing image of a relatable, forward-thinking governor was being replaced with something colder and more distant. The connection he once had with ordinary Californians was slipping away, replaced by the sense that he was speaking to a political agenda rather than to the people living with the consequences of his decisions. While his base was cooling, California's business community was heading for the exits. And not just small shops, you're talking about some of the biggest names in the country. Tesla, Oracle, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, Charles Schwab, CBRE. These weren't random companies, these were corporate giants that had once called California home. Their reasons were blunt: sky-high taxes, endless regulations, and a business climate so hostile it felt like the state was actively pushing them out. Executives didn't mince words, they were tired of trying to survive under what they saw as Newsom's suffocating rules. Each departure was a massive blow to the state's economy, and the ripple effects were obvious. When a company like Tesla leaves, it's not just a name disappearing from a building, it's thousands of jobs, millions in tax revenue, and an entire ecosystem of smaller businesses that depended on them. And these weren't political stunts, they were survival moves. To make matters worse, the exodus wasn't slowing down. Texas, Florida, Arizona, they were all rolling out the red carpet, offering lower taxes and fewer restrictions. California, meanwhile, was becoming a place businesses stayed only if moving was more expensive than staying put. The very state that once symbolized opportunity and innovation was now turning into a cautionary tale for entrepreneurs, and at the center of that shift was Gavin Newsom's leadership. And it wasn't just the economy taking the hit. The streets themselves told a story that was hard to ignore. In cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Oakland, the decline was everywhere you looked. Sidewalks littered with trash, discarded needles glinting in the sunlight, and in some areas, human waste pooling in gutters. Public spaces that were once filled with families and tourists had turned into open-air drug zones. The worst part? Everyone could see it. Residents spoke out, tourists posted videos online, and those clips went viral, painting an image of California that no glossy political ad could erase. And when foreign leaders visited, the hypocrisy was almost cartoonish.
On KBLA yesterday, with my friend Tavis Smiley. I'm an investor and a supporter of that station. And he said, "Who do you want to run for president?" I mentioned, "I think you'd be good at the job." Not this year, we know. No, I know. But he said, I don't think he could win. I don't think he could win. He's too progressive coming from this state and what he's done in this state to win in any southern state, any red state. I disagreed, but no, this is a progressive African-American owned station, and I'm sure they like you, but he doesn't think you can win. What do you say to that if you could win look at the swing states.
Before a major summit with Xi Jinping, Newsom ordered a cleanup of San Francisco's streets. Out came the crews. The streets were scrubbed spotless, and the day the motorcades left, the filth came right back. Critics called it a disgrace proof that the governor cared more about appearances than solving the root problems, and they had a point. The cleanup wasn't about making life better for residents. It was about hiding the mess from the cameras. This wasn't a one-off embarrassment. It became a symbol of his entire approach, treating deep, structural problems like they could be fixed with a quick photo op instead of real leadership and long-term solutions. Meanwhile, the streets kept getting worse, and the trust kept eroding. Then came the disasters, wildfires, tearing through communities, leaving behind blackened neighborhoods and families picking through ashes. Californians were desperate for leadership, for someone to step in with a real plan and swift action. But instead, what they got from Newsom was almost nothing. There was no clear emergency strategy, no rapid mobilization of resources. And while the smoke was still rising, another storm hit not from nature, but from opportunists. Land speculators started circling like vultures, scouting burned-out neighborhoods for future profit. People were still grieving, still trying to find a place to sleep, and already outsiders were eyeing their land. For many, this was the last straw. It wasn't just about the slow response, it was about what that slow response allowed to happen. Instead of protecting residents from predatory buyers, the state seemed to look the other way. And the hypocrisy was hard to miss. This was the same man who had once embraced sprawling homeless encampments in the name of compassion, now suddenly telling cities to ban them from sidewalks and parks. To critics, it felt like a bad joke, like putting up a fence after the stampede had already flattened the pasture. The message was clear. When real crises hit, Newsom wasn't leading from the front. He was reacting late, playing catch-up, and leaving people to fend for themselves while the problems multiplied. By now, the list of problems under his watch was impossible to ignore. Homelessness exploding across the state, crime rates climbing, streets filthier than ever, and an economy that felt like it was running out of oxygen. But instead of tackling these issues head-on, Newsom seemed more focused on the optics. It was as if every public appearance was designed for the cameras, not for the people actually living with the consequences. He'd brush off serious concerns as partisan noise, relying on polished speeches to paper over the cracks. But Californians could feel the difference between real action and a performance, and the patience was wearing thin. And the truth about politics is simple. People can smell desperation. They know when a leader is out of moves. They know when they're watching someone cling to an image instead of fixing problems. What they were seeing wasn't a steady hand guiding the state, it was chaos management, last-minute scrambling, dressed up as decisiveness. And that raised a bigger question in people's minds. If this is how he handles California, what would happen if he had the keys to the entire country? For many, that thought alone was enough to turn their frustration into outright rejection. The golden boy of California politics was starting to look like a warning sign, and the cracks in his armor were no longer possible to hide. The spark that lit this firestorm came from a single conversation. On a talk show, Bill Maher zeroed in on one of Newsom's most controversial policies, the rule that schools don't have to tell parents if their child changes gender identity at school. Maher called it out for what it was, saying it made the party look like it had no common sense. That moment landed like a punch. It wasn't a rant. It was a calm, surgical strike that exposed a side of Newsom people had been ignoring. The image of the smooth-talking governor suddenly looked slippery, even evasive. And once the curtain was pulled back, others piled on. Joe Rogan added his own knockout line, calling Newsom a sneaky, chameleon-like politician who constantly shifts to match the crowd. It was the kind of comment you couldn't spin away because it fit perfectly with what people had been noticing. One day he's waving the flag for open borders, the next he's talking tough on immigration, one day he's all in on progressive ideals, the next he's flirting with law and order rhetoric. The criticism painted him as a political weather vane, spinning in whichever direction got the loudest applause. And for voters, that meant there was no principle, no steady vision, just a man performing for whoever was watching. That's when the conversation shifted from, can he lead, to can we even trust him? And while the trust was fading, so was the money. Donors who once poured millions into his campaigns were suddenly quiet. The big political allies who used to defend him at every turn weren't rushing to the microphones anymore. What had been a steady drumbeat of support turned into an awkward silence. The dream of President Newsom was starting to evaporate. The buzz that once surrounded him had turned into little more than a whisper, and not the good kind. In political circles, people were already saying it out loud. He'd gone from a rising star to a liability. Joe Rogan's words stuck in the public's mind. This wasn't a real person they were seeing, it was a cardboard cutout, a manufactured image built for TV spots and campaign posters. The more people thought about it, the more it made sense. While other figures, love them or hate them, came across as human, flawed but authentic, Newsom felt scripted. The shift in perception was brutal. Instead of seeing a leader who stood firm in his beliefs, people saw someone who adjusted his stance like a salesman reading the room. And in politics, that's deadly. Once voters believe you're only saying what they want to hear, it's almost impossible to win them back. With the public mood turning and his inner circle losing confidence, his political brand wasn't just damaged, it was starting to collapse. Meanwhile, California's economic heartbeat was fading fast. Big corporations were already gone, but now smaller and mid-sized businesses were following them out the door. Restaurants, tech startups, manufacturing plants, they were all packing up and heading to places like Texas, Florida, and Arizona. This wasn't about chasing trends. These were survival moves. Business owners were tired of fighting against a system that punished success and buried growth under mountains of red tape. Taxes ate into their profits, permits took months or even years to get approved, and every new policy seemed to make it harder to operate. For many, California had become a trap. They weren't staying because they believed in Newsom's vision, they were staying because moving would cost more than they could handle. And that's not loyalty, that's desperation. The state that once represented innovation and opportunity was now becoming a case study in how ideology can strangle prosperity. Entrepreneurs used to come here with dreams of building something great. Now, they were leaving to keep their dreams alive. The irony was brutal. Newsom kept talking about being bullish on California, but the only thing growing was the list of businesses fleeing the state. Each departure was another reminder that the California dream was slipping away, and his leadership was right in the middle of it. And as the economy withered, the streets told an even darker story. California's once vibrant cities were now symbols of decay. San Francisco, Los Angeles, Oakland, names once associated with opportunity, were now trending online for all the wrong reasons. Sidewalks became home to sprawling homeless encampments. Trash piled up faster than it could be cleared. Open drug use happened in broad daylight, needles scattered in parks where children once played. In some neighborhoods, the smell of human waste wasn't occasional, it was constant. The images flooding social media were impossible to spin. Tourists filmed entire blocks that looked like disaster zones. Residents warned friends not to visit certain areas after dark. And the most damning moment came when Newsom admitted what everyone suspected: San Francisco was only cleaned up for visiting world leaders. Streets were scrubbed, tents vanished overnight, but the second the motorcades left, the filth returned. It was proof that the state could act when it wanted to, but only when the audience mattered. For everyday Californians, the same problems were left to rot. The cleanup wasn't about them, it was about hiding the mess. That single moment became the perfect metaphor for his leadership. Cosmetic fixes for the cameras, while the real issues festered out of sight. And Californians were starting to realize they were living in a state that looked better in press photos than in real life. California's decline wasn't just an accident, it was the result of years of leadership that valued appearance over action. And the pattern showed up everywhere. In disasters, Newsom's response was slow and disorganized. During wildfires, while families sifted through the remains of their homes, land speculators were already circling, and the state did little to stop them. The hypocrisy stung. This was the same leader who had once embraced homeless encampments, now suddenly telling cities to ban them from public spaces. To many, it felt like closing the barn door after the horses had bolted. The problems he had ignored or downplayed for years were now being treated like urgent crises, but only because the political cost of ignoring them had become too high. By the time the truth set in for most Californians, the damage was deep. The economy was bleeding, the streets were dangerous, and the once thriving cities had become cautionary tales. And in the middle of it all, Newsom's image, once untouchable, was in freefall. For a man who built his career on charm and confidence, this wasn't just a political setback. It was a collapse of the very persona that had carried him this far. And now, the question wasn't whether he could rise higher, it was how much farther he still had to fall. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to this channel. Also, drop your thoughts in the comments. See you on the next one.